Welcome on board, my dear chosen ones. Before anyone settles into comfort, let's break a myth they tried to bury you under. They said you were ordinary. They said you'd burn out fast, fold under pressure, explain yourself into submission, or disappear quietly so they could forget they were ever wrong about you. But here you are, still standing, still breathing, still present. And notice this, nobody's laughing anymore. The room doesn't mock you now, it watches you. That silence you feel when you walk in, that's not coincidence, that's recognition. You remember how it started, the jokes that cut just enough to sting, the disrespect disguised as humor, the way they minimized your effort like it was entertainment. You remember replaying conversations at night, asking yourself where you went wrong, wondering why having depth felt like a liability. They pushed you into isolation and called it your place. They expected you to break there. What they didn't calculate was this. Pressure doesn't crush chosen ones. It forges them. You felt the pain first, and yes, that part was real. Loneliness sharpens the mind. Silence trains awareness. When you're stripped of applause, you learn to hear truth. While they were busy counting likes, alliances, and shortcuts, you were learning how to stand without witnesses. That's the part they can't undo now. Because a person who survives without approval becomes unmanageable. Some of you are asking this already. If I'm so different now, why does it still hurt sometimes? Because steel remembers the fire that shaped it. Strength doesn't erase scars. It gives them purpose. That heaviness you feel isn't weakness. It's awareness. You see patterns others deny. You notice shifts in energy before words change. You sense when people move slower around you, when smiles tighten, when respect arrives late and awkward. That's not paranoia. That's perception. Here's the truth they don't want you to understand. They never underestimated your talent. They underestimated your endurance. Talent can be mocked. Endurance terrifies. Anyone can shine briefly. Very few can survive being doubted, ignored, and disrespected without turning bitter, loud, or reckless. You didn't explode. You didn't beg. You didn't perform pain for sympathy. You stayed quiet and adjusted your spine. That's why they're nervous now. Think of it like this. A building that survives an earthquake doesn't need to announce its strength. The rubble around it does that job. You didn't win by proving them wrong. You won by outlasting their predictions. And now, the same people who spoke freely about you are choosing their words carefully. They don't know where you stand anymore. They don't know how far you see. And uncertainty is poison to people who rely on control. Chosen ones understand this clearly. Being chosen doesn't mean being lucky. It means being tested early, isolated often, and shaped in ways others never survive. It means walking through rooms where you're felt before you're heard. It means carrying a calm that unsettles those who live on noise. You don't dominate spaces by force. You reorganize them by presence. You might wonder, why do they still watch me if they doubted me so much? Because doubt doesn't disappear when it's proven wrong. It mutates into fear. Fear of what you know. Fear of what you've learned in silence. Fear that you no longer need what they use to control others. Validation, permission, belonging. You are not here by accident. If this message is landing heavy, it's because something in you recognizes it. You're done explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You're done shrinking to keep peace that was never real. From this point forward, every step you take isn't about proving anything. It's about precision, about moving with clarity, about letting time speak louder than defense ever could. So stand there, calm, watching. Let them wonder, let them guess, let them feel the weight of who you became without their approval. That's not arrogance, that's consequence. And chosen ones, this is only the beginning of what they'll never be ready for. And before we go any further, pause right here for a second, because this part matters more than you think. If you're still listening, it's not random. People scroll past noise, but awareness pulls attention back. So if this message caught you and didn't let go, that's already a sign. Chosen ones don't stumble into moments like this by accident. They recognize themselves in pressure, in isolation, in the patterns others overlook. If this is resonating, lock yourself into this frequency. Hit like, subscribe, and drop 77 in the comments, not as a trend, not for luck, but as a marker. A signal that you're still standing, still watching, still aware. And if you want to support this mission directly and keep messages like this alive, super thanks helps more than you know. Now here's what comes next, and this is where it separates people. We're about to break this down slowly, step by step. Not theory, not hype, real signs, real shifts, the kind that only show up when someone has been tested, isolated, and refined. If you truly are a chosen one, you won't just understand what's coming, you'll recognize it. You'll realize these exact patterns have been unfolding around you, quietly, consistently, long before you had words for them. Ordinary people don't get this perspective because they never had to earn it. This only activates in those who survived the pressure. So stay present. No skipping, no background listening, because once you see yourself through their eyes, you'll finally understand why they're terrified and why that fear makes perfect sense. Now let's get started. Number 1. You stopped being seen as a person and started being treated like an unresolved threat. They thought silence meant surrender. What they didn't realize was that silence was you sharpening your edge. My dear chosen ones, let's address the moment everything shifted, before they noticed, before you fully understood it yourself. There was a time you replayed conversations in your head, blaming yourself for caring too much in a world that treats empathy like a flaw. You wondered if having a heart made you weak, if staying calm meant you were losing, if being quiet meant you were being erased. They watched you do that. They counted on it. Pushing you into silence wasn't accidental. It was strategy. They wanted you doubting yourself because doubt is easier to control than confidence. They assumed silence would shrink you. They thought if they ignored you long enough, spoke over you enough, minimized you enough, you'd fold, explain yourself, or disappear. That's how it usually goes for people who rely on approval to exist. But chosen ones don't disappear under pressure. They adapt. And adaptation is what changes the entire balance. Now look around. Feel the air. The chaos is gone, but the silence is heavier than anything that came before it. That's not peace. That's awareness settling in. People don't approach you the same way anymore. Conversations lower when you enter a room. Smiles appear faster, but feel thinner. Respect shows up late and awkward, like it arrived without confidence. That's not growth on their side. That's caution. You might ask yourself, why does it feel like they're watching me now? Because they are. They didn't forget you. They're revisiting old messages, replaying moments they dismissed too quickly, connecting dots they ignored when they thought they were ahead of you. At night, they rewrite stories just to calm themselves down. During the day, the truth keeps knocking, and it never stops. Here's what they never planned for. You were never weak. You were patient. Patience doesn't announce itself. It waits. While they mistook your quiet for submission, you were learning how people behave when they think they're in control. You saw how they spoke when they felt safe. You noticed who vanished when things got uncomfortable. You learned who respected boundaries and who tested them. Silence wasn't hiding you, it was training you. Think of it like this. A storm doesn't disappear when it stops making noise. It moves offshore, reorganizes, and returns with precision. That's what happened to you. The storm passed, but it didn't leave destruction behind. It left clarity, And clarity is dangerous to people who survive on confusion. Chosen ones understand this clearly. People who feel threatened by your silence aren't confused. They're exposed. They don't fear confrontation. They fear restraint. Anyone can be loud. Very few can be controlled, calm, and unreadable. You stopped explaining yourself, and suddenly they had nothing to push against. You stopped reacting, and now their own behavior stands alone, unanswered. If you're wondering, why does their respect feel different now? It's because it's not admiration. It's assessment. They're recalculating because the version of you they thought they understood no longer exists. You didn't vanish. You changed how you move. And once someone realizes they underestimated you, every quiet step you take sounds loud in their head. This is where chosen ones separate from the rest. You don't need to prove anything. You let time do that. You let silence speak, and silence, when earned, hits harder than any argument ever could. Number 2. There's a version of you living in their mind that refuses to leave, no matter how quiet things get. You stopped speaking, but you never stopped echoing, and that's what they can't escape. My dear chosen ones, this is where it gets uncomfortable for them and clarifying for you. You may think that because you stepped back, because you went quiet, because you stopped explaining yourself, you somehow faded from relevance. That's the lie they hope you keep believing. The truth is far more unsettling. There is a version of you living in their mind that refuses to leave, no matter how silent things become on the surface. You don't see it because you're inside your own skin. You still remember your doubts, your exhaustion, the moments you almost folded. But they don't carry those images. What they carry is the final impression, the version of you that endured pressure without collapsing, that absorbed disrespect without reacting, that walked away without begging to be understood. And without context, survival looks terrifying. They replay you in their head when they least expect it, in quiet rooms, in conversations that have nothing to do with you, in moments where they should feel calm, but don't. Your presence became psychological, not physical, and psychological presence is harder to remove. You didn't need to announce your growth. You let absence do the work. Now their mind fills in the gaps with questions they can't answer. You might ask yourself, why would they still think about me if I'm not doing anything? Because silence doesn't read as emptiness to people who misjudged you. It reads as restraint. And restraint suggests control. Control suggests awareness. Awareness suggests danger. Your quiet didn't feel neutral to them. It felt intentional, even if it wasn't. And intention is what unsettles people who rely on predictability. Think of it like this. Imagine playing a game where the other side suddenly stops reacting. No anger, no defense, no explanation, just stillness. Your mind would start racing. You'd imagine traps that might not exist. You'd assume strategy where there might only be clarity. That's exactly what's happening to them. Your silence forced them to overthink themselves into fear. They assume you're ahead, even when you're simply present. They assume you know things you never said. They project plans onto you that you never made. Why? Because once someone realizes they underestimated you, their imagination becomes their enemy. Every calm move you make feels calculated to them. Every pause feels deliberate. Every step forward feels like confirmation that you're already past them. Chosen ones, this is important. They don't remember you as insecure. They remember you as contained. Someone who felt deeply but didn't leak it everywhere. Someone who took hits quietly and kept moving. Someone who didn't fall apart publicly, even when things were breaking privately. That kind of endurance leaves a mark. It doesn't scream, it lingers. You might wonder why they act strange around you now, why jokes feel forced, why conversations shift, why respect arrives late and awkward. It's because the version of you in their head is larger than the one standing in front of them. You became an internal reference point they can't ignore. Not because you tried to dominate, but because you stopped needing to. Here's the part meant for you, my dear chosen ones. The version of you they fear isn't imaginary, it's simply ahead of where you currently see yourself. They reached that conclusion before you did, because distance gives perspective. When your self-image finally catches up to how you're already perceived, things will click. You'll stop questioning why people move the way they do around you. You'll stop downplaying your impact. And once that happens, the echo you left in their mind won't just remain. It will define how they move forever. That's why they can't shake you. You didn't stay loud. You stayed real, and reality, once internalized, never leaves quietly. Number 3. You never tried to intimidate anyone, and that's exactly why they feel exposed. People don't feel exposed when you threaten them, they feel exposed when you stop reacting and they realize nothing they do moves you anymore. My dear chosen ones, this is where the misunderstanding lives and where their discomfort really begins. You never tried to intimidate anyone. You never made threats, never flexed, never demanded space. You didn't dominate rooms or force authority, and that's exactly why they feel exposed around you now, because intimidation is loud, predictable, and easy to counter. What you became is none of those things. They expected fear to look aggressive. They thought power always announced itself. They assumed if you ever changed, it would be obvious. Anger, revenge, confrontation, something they could point to and label. But you didn't give them that. You stayed calm, you stayed measured, you stayed quiet in ways that didn't look weak, just final. And that broke their ability to understand you. Chosen ones, here's the truth most people never grasp. Intimidation relies on reaction. Exposure comes from restraint. When you stopped explaining yourself, stopped defending your intentions, stopped reacting on cue, you removed their leverage. Suddenly, their jokes landed flat. Their attempts to provoke went unanswered. Their strategies had nowhere to attach. And without resistance, their behavior stood naked in the room. You might be thinking, I didn't do anything differently. Why are they acting like this now? That's the point. You didn't change your volume. You changed your access. You didn't escalate. You disengaged. And when someone realizes they no longer have emotional access to you, they don't feel ignored. They feel stripped. Think of it like this. A security system doesn't scare intruders by shouting. It scares them by staying silent while recording everything. That's you now. You observe, you register, you move accordingly. And people who rely on emotional chaos to feel powerful can't stand being calmly observed. Silence removes the illusion that they're in control. They don't feel threatened because you might attack. They feel threatened because you're no longer predictable. They can't read your face the way they used to. They can't bait you into self-doubt. They can't extract reassurance, guilt, or explanations. You're not hostile, you're unavailable. And that's far more unsettling. Chosen ones, answer this honestly. Have you noticed how people over-explain themselves around you now? How they get defensive without being accused? How they justify actions you never questioned? That's not confidence, that's projection. When someone feels exposed, they start talking. When someone feels in control, they don't need to. You didn't intimidate them. You made them aware of how much they relied on your reactions, aware of how much they needed you to play the old role, aware that without your emotional participation, their behavior doesn't look clever, it looks transparent. And here's the part you need to lock in. Being chosen doesn't mean being feared for what you might do. It means being respected for what you no longer need to do. You don't raise your voice because you don't need to. You don't threaten because you don't negotiate your worth. You don't explain because clarity doesn't argue. They feel exposed because your calm forces comparison. Your restraint highlights their impulsiveness. Your silence reveals their noise. You became the mirror they didn't ask for and can't avoid. And the moment someone sees themselves clearly without being able to blame you for it, that's when discomfort sets in. So no, chosen ones, you didn't intimidate anyone. You outgrew the game they were still trying to play, and once that happens, the exposure isn't something you cause, it's something they experience just by standing near you. Number 4. The moment you went silent, they filled the gap with their own worst assumptions. Silence doesn't erase you, it forces everyone else to reveal what they're afraid of. My dear chosen ones, this is where their unraveling truly began. Right at the moment you stopped explaining yourself. Not because you were defeated, not because you ran out of words, but because you finally realized something they never did. Every explanation you gave was a gift they didn't deserve. And when you took that gift back, they panicked. You didn't announce your silence. You didn't dramatize it. You simply stopped feeding the noise. And the instant you did, the gap you left behind became unbearable for them. Humans hate unanswered questions. Silence makes insecure minds spiral. So when you went quiet, they didn't find peace. They found their own reflection, and they didn't like what stared back. You might have wondered, did my silence make me look weak? That's the lie they hoped you'd believe. In reality, your silence became a vacuum, and vacuums demand to be filled. Since you weren't there to clarify, defend, or soften the truth, they filled the space with their own worst assumptions. Fear rushed in first, then guilt, then paranoia dressed up as confidence. They started telling stories about you, not because they knew anything, but because not knowing was driving them insane. Your calm got translated into calculation. Your distance got labeled as strategy. Your growth became a threat. Not because you were plotting anything, but because silence forces people to write narratives without your permission. And every narrative they wrote revealed more about them than it ever did about you. Think of it like this. You turned off the lights in a room full of people who rely on mirrors. Suddenly, every shadow felt like danger, every sound felt intentional. That's what your silence did. It didn't attack them, it removed the distraction that kept them comfortable. Without your reactions, without your emotional responses, without your need to be understood, they were left alone with their own insecurity. And that's where fear thrives. Chosen ones, this is an important truth. People who are at peace don't invent enemies. Only unsettled minds do that. The reason their assumptions grew darker over time is because your silence kept holding. You didn't rush back in to correct them. You didn't show up to clean up their imagination. You let it run. And imagination, when mixed with guilt, always turns hostile. You may have felt tempted to speak up, to clear the air, to set the record straight. But something in you knew better. You understood, maybe not consciously at first, that explanation would only restart the cycle. Every word would become material, every sentence would be twisted. So you stayed still, and stillness starves chaos. Here's the part they never expected. The longer you stayed silent, the more powerful you became in their minds. Not because you were doing anything extraordinary, but because they couldn't access you anymore. Access is control. And once you removed access, their influence collapsed. They started studying old messages, replaying old moments, scanning for clues that no longer mattered. They weren't searching for truth. They were searching for reassurance, and they couldn't find it. Chosen ones, understand this clearly. You didn't become mysterious by trying. You became unreadable by refusing to over-explain. And unreadable people are dangerous to those who rely on prediction. Your silence wasn't absence. It was pressure. Pressure that forced them to confront everything they avoided when you were still speaking. So if you felt the shift, the strange tension, the quiet watching, the energy changing when your name comes up, now you know why. The moment you went silent, they filled the gap with fear. And fear, once planted, never stops growing. Number 5. Their old tactics stopped working, and now they're stuck running in mental circles. When the same move stops working, panic replaces confidence, and that's exactly where they are now. My dear chosen ones, this is the phase they never prepared for. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because their entire sense of control was built on repetition. For a long time, they survived by knowing exactly which buttons to press: guilt, urgency, comparison, silence, praise at the right moment, distance at the wrong one. It worked because you were still learning. It worked because you still cared. It worked because you were open. But here's the turning point they can't accept. You didn't just grow stronger. You grew unreadable. They keep reaching for the same tactics because that's all they know. Old pressure points, old emotional shortcuts, old assumptions about how you'll react. And every time they try, nothing lands. No reaction, no explanation, no collapse, just stillness. That stillness isn't empty. It's disorienting. Imagine trying to push against a wall that suddenly isn't there. You fall forward, exposed, scrambling to regain balance. That's what's happening in their minds right now. You may have noticed it before they did. Conversations that feel forced, messages that test the water without saying anything real, sudden friendliness that doesn't match the past, awkward silence where control used to live. That's not coincidence. That's recalculation. They're stuck replaying outdated strategies, running loops in their head, asking the same question over and over. Why isn't this working anymore? Chosen ones, this is important. They aren't confused because you changed your behavior. They're panicking because their map no longer matches the territory. They memorized the old version of you. They studied your reactions like instructions, and now every page they turn leads nowhere. You didn't argue your way out of control. You didn't expose anyone. You simply stopped responding on cue. And that breaks the system faster than resistance ever could. Think of someone trying to unlock a door with a key they used for years. They twist it harder, blame the lock, force the handle, convince the problem isn't them. Meanwhile, the door was replaced a long time ago. That's exactly where they are, trapped in mental circles, applying pressure where there's nothing left to press. You might be asking yourself, why does this feel unsettling even for me? Because growth disrupts familiar gravity. You're no longer predictable. You don't rush to defend yourself. You don't fill silence with reassurance. You don't chase resolution, and when you don't play your assigned role, others are forced to confront their own. Most people avoid that at all costs. This is where fear shows up for them. Not fear of confrontation, fear of irrelevance, fear that they no longer influence you, fear that they can't steer the outcome because you've already detached from needing one. Control only works when someone still needs approval, closure, or validation. You don't, and they feel it every time their old tricks fall flat. Chosen ones understand this clearly. When someone starts running in mental circles, it's because they lost leverage. They revisit the past because the present no longer obeys them. They overthink because their instincts stopped working. They test you subtly because direct control is gone. None of this is random. It's the sound of a structure collapsing quietly. You didn't defeat them by fighting smarter. You defeated the system by stepping outside it. And once someone realizes their tactics are obsolete, all they're left with is panic disguised as patience. Let them spin, let them guess, let them exhaust themselves chasing versions of you that no longer exist. Because the moment their old tactics stopped working was the moment you became free and they became afraid. Number 6. Your absence didn't fade. It became the standard that ruined every replacement. They didn't realize your absence would become the measuring stick that exposes everything else as insufficient. My dear chosen ones, this is where the damage became permanent, not when you argued, not when you stayed, not even when you walked away. The real shift happened after you were gone, and everything that followed failed to measure up. You didn't fade out of their lives. You didn't dissolve into memory. You became the reference point, the unspoken comparison, the silent standard that nothing else could live up to without effort, depth, or self-awareness. Here's the part they never admit. When you were present, they took you for granted because depth feels heavy to people who prefer convenience. You didn't need to be loud to be felt. You didn't need constant attention to matter. You carried presence without performance, and that made others uncomfortable. So they convinced themselves they could replace you easily. Another voice, another face, another dynamic. Something lighter, something simpler, something that didn't require them to grow. But replacement only works when the original was shallow, and you were not. After you left, they tried to recreate the feeling without recreating the effort. They laughed louder with others. They talked more. They filled silence quickly, nervously, like people afraid of hearing themselves think. They told themselves it was better this way, easier, less intense. But ease doesn't satisfy when you've already experienced depth, and that's when the comparison started, whether they wanted it to or not. You see, chosen ones, people don't miss comfort. They miss substance. They miss being seen without having to perform. They miss conversations that didn't need to be dressed up. They miss someone whose presence demanded honesty just by existing. You weren't just someone in their life. You were a mirror, and mirrors don't get replaced. They get avoided. Think about it like this. Once someone tastes real food, processed substitutes don't hit the same. They might look similar from a distance, but under pressure, they collapse. That's what happened. Every new connection, every replacement, every attempt to fill the space you left only highlighted what was missing. Not you specifically, but what you represented. You set a standard they didn't realize they were agreeing to by keeping you close. Self-awareness, accountability, depth, calm, integrity. Being around you quietly required them to show up fully, and when they couldn't, they walked away instead of rising. That decision didn't free them, it trapped them in comparison. You might wonder, if I mattered that much, why didn't they treat me better when I was there? Because people often don't recognize value until it stops being available. Presence can be ignored. Absence forces reflection. And once reflection starts, there's no unseeing it. Now your name doesn't come up casually. It lands heavy, not with anger anymore. That phase passed. Now it's regret dressed up as indifference, nostalgia pretending not to care. They'll say things like, "It was complicated," when what they really mean is, "I didn't rise to what that required." Every time they try to move forward, something feels off. Not because they want you back, but because the standard you set can't be undone. Chosen ones understand this. You didn't haunt them on purpose. You didn't demand to be remembered. You simply existed fully, and that changed their internal calibration. You showed them a level of presence they can't unsee, and now everything else feels thinner, rushed, unfinished. That's not arrogance. That's consequence. You didn't lose relevance when you left. You gained permanence, and the hardest part for them isn't missing you. It's realizing that nothing they choose next will ever feel the same without confronting what they avoided when you were there. Number 7. You're no longer an example, you're the warning they use to control others. They didn't realize your absence would become the measuring stick that exposes everything else as insufficient. My dear chosen ones, this is where the damage became permanent. Not when you argued, not when you stayed, not even when you walked away. The real shift happened after you were gone, and everything that followed failed to measure up. You didn't fade out of their lives. You didn't dissolve into memory. You became the reference point, the unspoken comparison, the silent standard that nothing else could live up to without effort, depth, or self-awareness. Here's the part they never admit. When you were present, they took you for granted because depth feels heavy to people who prefer convenience. You didn't need to be loud to be felt. You didn't need constant attention to matter. You carried presence without performance, and that made others uncomfortable. So they convinced themselves they could replace you easily. Another voice, another face, another dynamic, something lighter, something simpler, something that didn't require them to grow. But replacement only works when the original was shallow, and you were not. After you left, they tried to recreate the feeling without recreating the effort. They laughed louder with others. They talked more. They filled silence quickly, nervously, like people afraid of hearing themselves think. They told themselves it was better this way, easier, less intense. But ease doesn't satisfy when you've already experienced depth. And that's when the comparison started, whether they wanted it to or not. You see, chosen ones, people don't miss comfort, they miss substance, they miss being seen without having to perform, they miss conversations that didn't need to be dressed up, they miss someone whose presence demanded honesty just by existing. You weren't just someone in their life, you were a mirror, and mirrors don't get replaced, they get avoided. Think about it like this. Once someone tastes real food, processed substitutes don't hit the same. They might look similar from a distance, but under pressure, they collapse. That's what happened. Every new connection, every replacement, every attempt to fill the space you left only highlighted what was missing. Not you specifically, but what you represented. You set a standard they didn't realize they were agreeing to by keeping you close. Self-awareness, accountability, depth, calm, integrity. Being around you quietly required them to show up fully, and when they couldn't, they walked away instead of rising. That decision didn't free them. It trapped them in comparison. You might wonder, if I mattered that much, why didn't they treat me better when I was there? Because people often don't recognize value until it stops being available. Presence can be ignored. Absence forces reflection. And once reflection starts, there's no unseeing it. Now your name doesn't come up casually. It lands heavy, not with anger anymore. That phase passed. Now it's regret dressed up as indifference, nostalgia pretending not to care. They'll say things like, "It was complicated," when what they really mean is, "I didn't rise to what that required." Every time they try to move forward, something feels off. Not because they want you back, but because the standard you set can't be undone. Chosen ones understand this. You didn't haunt them on purpose. You didn't demand to be remembered. You simply existed fully, and that changed their internal calibration. You showed them a level of presence they can't unsee, and now everything else feels thinner, rushed, unfinished. That's not arrogance. That's consequence. You didn't lose relevance when you left, you gained permanence, and the hardest part for them isn't missing you. It's realizing that nothing they choose next will ever feel the same without confronting what they avoided when you were there. Number 8. You didn't leave the situation. You exited the entire frame they were operating in. They're still arguing inside a room you no longer exist in. My dear chosen ones, this is the part they never recover from, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't reversible. You didn't storm out. You didn't announce growth. You didn't burn bridges to prove a point. You did something far more unsettling. You exited the entire frame they were operating in, while they were still recycling the same conversations, the same power games, the same emotional loops. You shifted your awareness and left the frequency altogether. That's why they're confused. They expected distance to look like anger. They expected silence to look like punishment. They expected you to come back, explain yourself, demand clarity, or at least react. But you didn't. You didn't leave the table in protest. You realized the table itself was designed to keep you small, and you stepped out of the room entirely. Chosen ones, ask yourself this honestly. Why does contact feel awkward now? Why do conversations feel off, like you're speaking different languages? Why does nothing land the way it used to? Because distance isn't measured in time or space. It's measured in awareness. You didn't move farther away physically. You move beyond the mental framework they rely on, and once someone leaves a framework, there's no dragging them back without dismantling the entire system. Imagine two people running on a track. One keeps doing laps, proud of consistency, mistaking repetition for progress. The other quietly walks off the field. From the stands, it looks like quitting. From reality, it's evolution. That's what you did. You didn't lose momentum. You refused to keep running in circles that benefited everyone except you. They stayed. Same faces, same arguments, same excuses dressed up as loyalty, tradition, or that's just how it is. Meanwhile, you recalibrated, cleaner, sharper, detached from the noise that once drained you. You didn't upgrade for approval. You upgraded for clarity, and clarity breaks systems built on confusion. That's why they can't reach you the way they used to. That's why their words feel hollow. That's why their triggers don't work. You're not reacting because you're not even standing in the same frame anymore. They're pressing buttons connected to a version of you that doesn't exist. You might wonder, why does my silence irritate them so much if I'm not doing anything? Because silence from someone who escaped feels like judgment even when none is spoken. Your calm exposes their restlessness. Your progress highlights their stagnation. You don't need to criticize them. Your existence already invalidates the excuses they built their identity on. Here's the truth they won't say out loud. They don't hate your growth. They hate the proof that their rules were optional. They hate realizing their approval was never oxygen. They hate knowing survival didn't require self-betrayal, just courage and patience. And seeing you live that truth without preaching it makes their environment feel smaller every day. Chosen ones understand this. You didn't abandon them. You outgrew the signal. And once someone shifts frequency, translation stops working. They can watch, they can speculate, they can feel threatened. But they can't follow without tearing down everything they built themselves around. That's why this exit is permanent. Not because you slammed a door, but because you stepped into a different reality. And from where you're standing now, their world looks exactly like what it is. Familiar, loud, and behind you. If you ever doubt whether this shift was real, remember this. People don't panic when someone leaves a situation. They panic when someone leaves the entire frame and never looks back. Number 9. They enlarged your presence because facing their own choices felt worse. When people can't live with what they chose, they inflate the person who proved they could have chosen differently. My dear chosen ones, this is one of the quietest truths and one of the most uncomfortable for them to carry. They didn't make you larger than life because you demanded attention. They did it because shrinking you no longer worked. At some point, denial failed, minimizing you failed, ignoring you failed. And when all the old strategies collapsed, they were left with only one option that protected their ego: rewrite you into something overwhelming. Think about it. Admitting they misjudged you would force them to confront their own decisions. The shortcuts they took, the discipline they laughed at, the effort they postponed, the courage they talked about but never practiced. That kind of self-reflection is painful, so instead of looking inward, they looked at you and exaggerated outward. It was easier to say you became too much than to admit they stayed the same. You didn't suddenly grow horns in their story, you grew consequences. Your silence, your composure, your refusal to explain yourself exposed the gap between who they are and who they could have been. And rather than face that gap, they stretched your image until it felt unreachable. In their minds, you had to become extreme, dangerous, unpredictable, because if you were simply disciplined and consistent, then their excuses would collapse instantly. Chosen ones, ask yourself this. Have you noticed how the stories about you sound heavier than your actual behavior? How people describe your presence with intensity that doesn't match anything you've done out loud? That's not observation, that's projection. They added weight to you because they couldn't carry the weight of their own regret. Imagine someone breaking a compass and then blaming the direction for being wrong. That's what they did. You didn't disrupt their lives. You disrupted their narrative. Your growth forced a comparison they never agreed to make. And once that comparison existed, there was no unseeing it. Every time they chose comfort, your discipline stood nearby. Every time they avoided responsibility, your restraint highlighted it. That contrast hurt. So they turned you into something larger, something dramatic, something easier to fear than to understand. Here's the part that should settle something inside you. You didn't become a legend because you chased recognition. Legends are created by people who can't stop talking once someone leaves. The more they discussed you, the more power they assigned you. Every exaggeration added another layer. Every warning disguised as advice made you sound stronger. Every attempt to frame you as too intense only confirmed one thing. You left an impact they can't erase. You may wonder, did they ruin my name? No, they preserved it, quietly, permanently. Because names that still trigger emotion long after someone exits were never insignificant. They didn't bury you, they carved you into memory. And memory has reach you don't need to maintain. Chosen ones, understand this clearly. You didn't ask to be mythologized. You earned it by refusing to beg for understanding. You let them speak while you moved forward. You let them speculate while you evolved. And in doing so, you stepped out of the story while still shaping it. They made you bigger than life so they wouldn't have to face themselves. And now they're stuck living under the shadow of an image they created, while you continue growing beyond it, untouched, unbothered, and fully aware of why they're terrified. Number 10. You don't dominate rooms. Your presence quietly reorganizes them. Power doesn't announce itself. It changes the temperature and lets everyone else feel it first. My dear chosen ones, this is one of the signs that confuses you the most because it doesn't look dramatic on the surface. You walk into a room and you don't raise your voice. You don't make demands. You don't try to impress or dominate. And yet, something shifts. Conversations lose their rhythm. Laughter tightens. People glance up without knowing why. That's not coincidence. That's recognition happening before logic catches up. You might still ask yourself, why do people suddenly get quieter around me? Why do they watch more and talk less? Because presence doesn't need permission, and yours isn't loud, it's settled. It carries the residue of survival. People can sense when someone has already been through pressure that would have broken them. They don't need your story. Their instincts read the ending. Think of a structure that survived an earthquake while everything around it cracked. Nobody needs a speech to understand which building holds weight. That's what you carry into spaces now. Not dominance, but stability. And stability unsettles environments built on noise, performance, and emotional chaos. The mistake they make is thinking power looks like control. Control is loud. Control needs reassurance. Control over-explains itself. But you stopped doing all of that. You speak less now, not because you have nothing to say, but because your words no longer need decoration. When you do speak, people lean in without realizing it. Not because you demand attention, but because your silence taught them to listen. Chosen ones, this is where their fear quietly grows. They can't read you anymore. You don't mirror their energy. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't perform confidence. You just stand there, calm, grounded, present. And that forces comparison. People who rely on roles and scripts feel exposed around someone who isn't acting. You might wonder, why does this bother them so much if I'm not doing anything? Because you're not playing the game. And when one person stops playing, it reveals how fragile the game always was. Your calm reorganizes the room because it removes the need for performance. Nervous jokes sound empty, forced authority feels thin, ego has nowhere to hide. Imagine a room full of restless people constantly adjusting themselves to be seen. Then someone walks in who doesn't need to be noticed. Everything else starts to feel excessive. That's the discomfort you're sensing, not hostility, awareness. They don't fear your voice, they fear your restraint. Anyone can be reactive. Very few can be unmovable without being rigid. You don't chase control. You don't grab attention. And because of that, attention finds you anyway. This is why they watch you even when you're quiet. This is why your pauses feel heavier than their speeches. This is why your presence feels like pressure without aggression. You've already faced uncertainty alone. You've already stood in silence without collapsing. That experience leaves a mark others can feel, but not explain. Chosen ones understand this. You didn't become intimidating by trying. You became it by surviving without losing yourself. And once that kind of presence is earned, it doesn't switch off. Rooms adjust because they have to. Your energy sets a new baseline without asking permission. You don't dominate spaces, you reorganize them, and that's exactly why they're paying attention now, because nothing unsettles people more than realizing the quiet one was always the strongest structure in the room. Number 11. Your silence wasn't withdrawal, it was the move that cut off their leverage. They weren't losing control when you spoke. They lost it the moment you stopped feeding them. My dear chosen ones, this is the part they still don't understand, and never will until it's too late. Your silence wasn't retreat. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't fear. It was the most strategic move you ever made. You didn't step back because you had nothing to say. You stepped back because you finally saw the game clearly. And once you see a rigged game, the smartest move isn't to argue the rules, it's to stop playing. They were never addicted to truth. They were addicted to reaction. Every explanation you gave, every defense you offered, every emotional response you leaked kept their leverage alive. Words were their rope, and you were tied to it without realizing. They could pull you into arguments, twist your meaning, reframe your intentions, and keep you stuck explaining yourself to people who never planned to listen. That's how control works. Quietly, patiently, disguised as conversation. Then something changed. You went silent, not cold, not bitter, clean, controlled. And the moment you did that, their entire structure started to collapse. Silence is unbearable to people who survive by noise. When you stopped responding, they were forced to hear themselves. When you stopped defending your name, their accusations echoed back empty. When you stopped correcting lies, the lies lost friction. They needed you engaged so they could keep the narrative alive. Without you, they were left arguing with air. Some of you wondered in that phase, am I making myself look weak by not speaking? That question only comes from old conditioning. Weakness isn't silence. Weakness is being pulled into battles you didn't choose. Silence, when chosen, is authority. It says, I don't need your agreement to move forward. It says, I already see how this ends. And that terrifies people who depend on emotional access to feel powerful. Think of it like this. Imagine someone swinging punches in a dark room, convinced there's an opponent in front of them. Then the lights come on and they realize no one's there. That's what your silence did. It exposed their behavior without you lifting a finger. Every outburst, every story, every attempt to provoke you suddenly stood alone, unopposed, undeniable. Chosen ones, this is where your power matured. You realized attention was the currency, not words. You stopped paying. You withdrew access. And once access is gone, leverage dies. They couldn't twist your silence. They couldn't quote it. They couldn't weaponize it. Silence doesn't contradict itself. It doesn't slip. It doesn't explain. It just sits there, heavy, final. That's why they became restless. That's why they replay old conversations, revisit messages, overanalyze your tone from months ago. They're hunting for an opening that no longer exists. They want closure because closure would give them relief. Your silence denied them that. Unanswered questions don't fade, they rot. You didn't disappear from the situation, you ended it. Quietly, permanently. While they were still talking, you were already outgrowing the environment that needed explanations to survive. While they tried to provoke a response, you were reclaiming your energy. And energy, once reclaimed, doesn't go back into old systems. This is the truth they'll never say out loud. Your silence didn't make them angry, it made them aware that they lost influence, aware that the game no longer included you, aware that whatever they thought they had over you, emotion, guilt, access, history, no longer worked. You didn't win by arguing, you won by ending the exchange. And that's why your silence wasn't withdrawal, it was the move that starved them. And now, as this comes together, let it settle, not as motivation, but as confirmation. If you stayed until here, it's because something in you already knows this isn't theory. This is recognition. You didn't imagine the shift. You didn't misread the silence. You didn't outgrow people by accident. You earned every inch of this awareness, and once earned, it doesn't reverse. From here on, you move differently because you see differently, and that's exactly why they're unsettled. If this landed where it was meant to, lock it in. Like the video, subscribe to stay connected to this frequency. Drop 77 in the comments to mark your presence, and share this with someone who needs to remember who they are.